So it's been just over a year now since I released my first study on this concept of how increased transparency has changed Congress dramatically. And when I launched this video, there was a lot of stuff I didn't know. I knew next to nothing about the Committee of the Whole. I knew next to nothing about Richard Conlin and his involvement in the passage of the bill. Conlin was a lobbyist, and he was working on the fourth floor of the Longworth building. So he had an office inside the building built for congressmen. Very rare thing in history. And so even though it's a little bit over an hour long and it's full of evidence and data, when I released this, I was lacking a couple things that I really was hoping to find but didn't know if I was going to be able to find them. And one of the most important things when you do a study like this is, can you find a metric, some way of measuring increased transparency and showing how increased transparency might create certain effects? And so after months of really digging in and studying the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1970 and the Government and the Sunshine Act of 1976, which I didn't talk about at all in the original video, but that's the one that dramatically opens up the committees, in particular the Senate committee. So opening up all the drafting of the bills and the writing of the bills to public observation, basically to lobbyists. And so a few months into this research, I actually stumbled upon something which really changed the game. I found my first true metric. And that metric is the amount of roll call voting that took place over the years. And so in this first graph, we see the amount of roll call voting that took place in the Senate from 1969 to 2010. And what's important is that for all of previous time, this number actually was a bit lower than this, but it hovered somewhere between 400 and 600 and stayed pretty flat. There was a change in the 1930s when the Senate importantly got rid of the Committee of the Whole. And so you see that the Senate open voting is between 600 and 400. And as we'll see later, the House of Representatives throughout the past was much lower. So it was around 200. And that has a lot to do with the removal of the Committee of the Whole, but the Senate's a different beast in general. So I don't want to say they're apples and apples, but the Senate does paint a nice little picture here. So notice that the number of roll call votes in the Senate has not changed over time. Sure, it's gone up and down, but over the last 50 and even maybe the last 100 years, it's hovered around 500, 600 votes. So not a dramatic change in the Senate. But here, looking at the House, we see an enormous change. Okay, as I said before, throughout time, the House of Representatives was hovering around 200 all the way back to 1789. So these are the number of roll call votes, open votes, not the number of secret votes. We don't know the exact number of secret votes. And remember, the majority of the secret votes took place in the Committee of the Whole, and they were often on things like a single line that was being amended to a bill, or maybe a paragraph. Okay, so very tiny things, and there'd be lots and lots of these votes. And throughout time, 1789 to 1970, they were all secret. Okay, and what's interesting is that when you talk about the House of Representatives or the Senate, they don't talk about it as secret ballots and open ballots. They call it roll call. Okay, so roll call means they go around the room, they ask everybody's name, just like in the Lincoln movie, and people will say to the entire Congress and the gallery out loud how they voted. That's clearly a form of open voting. And there were numerous ways that they voted which were more secret. And they had various levels of secrecy, but by all accounts, it was next to impossible to figure out how a congressman voted when they were voting inside the Committee of the Whole in one of the many secret methods. So here we are, graph 2, the big change, roll call voting in the House. So roll call votes rose dramatically, up 400% from 1970, an enormous, enormous increase. So this is a massive change, and this is starting to look like a nice metric for figuring out how the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1970, which focused entirely on the House of Representatives, to open voting in the Committee of the Whole. Okay, so now here we've got graph number 3, and this is just looking at soaring inequality. So this has nothing to do with the House, it has nothing to do with roll call votes. This is Thomas Piketty's famous data that he released in 2014. He's been working on for many years, showing the massive increase in income inequality. So the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. So much so that many people have called this a brand new Gilded Age. And indeed, the numbers compare almost exactly to where we were in the first Gilded Age, which will be a subject for another video because transparency plays a big role there again. Okay, so in April of 2014, Thomas Piketty released his disturbing data on the enormous year-to-year growth in inequality, which is now up over 300%. Okay, so roll call voting's up over 400% and inequality's up 300%. So very comparable numbers, enormous changes from 1970. And again, it's important to remember the history. From the 1930s, inequality had been dropping steadily, and it started to turn and flatten out around 1970, and then in 1976, it started to jump up again. And as we've suggested, growing inequality means that each year the rich earn more and more of the nation's wealth and the poor earn less. And this graph would change dramatically if you went from the top 1% to even the top 0.1%. And we'd see much more than a 300% rate. We might go up to like 600%. I don't know. but it's an enormous change. And the smaller we make this scope, the larger a jump we get. But there's no question that the rich are getting fabulously richer and the poor aren't faring nearly so well. Okay, so here's graph number 4. And as you might have already guessed, there are two things that should not be correlated that we've just seen. Here's the House roll calls, remember this dotted line, and here's inequality. Okay, there should be no income relationship to rising House roll call votes. Indeed, the whole idea was to lower income inequality. So these things should not be correlated at all. We should actually expect income inequality to be doing the opposite, but it's not. So ideally, income inequality and House roll calls should not be correlated at all. That's why many folks said that the 1970 LRA should be passed. They were expecting that the two, increased transparency, would have a negative correlation with income inequality. But tragically, we get the exact opposite. The correlation is strong and positive, and it's even phase shifted to suggest that it might be causation. And in another video, I'll talk about this nasty hump right here, because here's where the bill was passed. Here's when it became active, and right here they actually noticed there was an enormous problem going on. So they passed legislation basically to stop what I talk about in another video, the Torpedo Amendments. These are really nasty amendments that serve nobody at all and are used to actually shoot like bullets at other congressmen. And so you have all this terrible legislation being written just to create warfare among congressmen. And they realized that was a problem here in 1978, and they passed some legislation to try and control torpedo amendments. They didn't change the level of transparency. They just passed legislation to try and limit this problem. And they did. And so things dropped down for a while. People stopped proposing so many torpedo amendments, and then things started to level out again here, and they started to jump back up. And there is even some legislation that happened right here, which caused this other bump. And we'll talk about that in other videos. So it's kind of hidden here, but this graph alone suggests that there might be a problem. So remember, I did this video based entirely on theory, and I had some interesting data. I never expected I would find something that would correlate this dramatically. As you might be aware, social institutions rarely have such clean and obvious looking data. This was a huge moment. I believe there was an enormous problem. I believe that transparency was creating this problem with inequality and partisanship, which we'll see in a second, but I never imagined I would find a metric so clean. And this isn't the only metric we have, but this is phenomenal stuff. And no one has ever put forth these graphs together before. So this is new stuff. And just to wrap this all up, I threw back on the line from the Senate, which wasn't hit nearly as hard by the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1970. So they didn't have a committee of the whole to really open up. So we see that the Senate voting has kind of remained constant. There was this huge moment, crazy transparency and torpedo bills, but after that all went away, they flattened out as expected, and the House kept going up and inequality kept going up. And it's important to realize that the Senate also was subject to massive transparency issues in 1976. And that's when inequality really started to turn. And this was the Government in the Sunshine Bill, which massively opened up Senate committees. Okay, so lobbyists could sit in there and watch the Senate doing their stuff. They could hand them legislation. They could yell at them. But most importantly, the lobbyists could just sit there and watch them.